And let's talk about the 2025 online conference for IASD, which you will also be presenting at. The conferences here will be online, and Bernard Welt here will be doing a presentation on Winsor McCay and how artists display their own theories of dreaming, and they're just as compelling as those as of psychologists. So I would love to talk about that. Tell me, what can we expect from your presentation this year?
Okay, as Amina has said, I think it's significant that we learn a lot about dreams from the work of artists. And as I've suggested earlier, a lot of psychologists are inspired by the work of artists. We don't necessarily know whether it comes from their actual dreams. Fictional dreams, people have noticed since the time of Cicero in the Roman Empire. People have noticed that fictional dreams can be learned from, can be analyzed, can be thought about in the same way as real dreams are. It was an interesting insight that he had because he was noticing the prevalence of dreams in Greek tragedy and actually connecting them in a way that moderns would recognize to main themes in the characters, what they feared, what they hoped for. So it didn't start with Freud, it didn't start with the modern era. People have learned from artwork and from artistic representations, even fictional representations of dreams, for a very, very long time. Most of the psychologists that we think of, at least, are familiar with Shakespeare, as we've talked about if you've looked at the discussion of Midsummer Night's Dream. But one particular artist I'd wanted to focus on for some time, and I've looked at his work for a very long time. I just want to mention that I came to a lot of this material because I do interdisciplinary study, and my course on dreams at the Corcoran School of the Arts and Design in Washington was an interdisciplinary course. It wasn't based in a psychology department. It covered all aspects, anthropology, cultural study, etc., as well as modern psychological theories. So one artist I wanted to introduce my art student friends to was the American cartoon artist Winsor McCay. And, he was acknowledged even in his own time as a genius, a person who was doing a Sunday comic strip that appeared in newspapers. And art critics were looking at this work after a little while and saying, just judged objectively in whatever art critical terms we have, this is kind of as good as the fine art that's appearing in galleries. It's not the way that people usually think about comic strips, but there's something very, very special about Winsor McCay. For one thing, as an artist, he had an extraordinary command of draftsmanship. And then as color comics began to appear, an extraordinary command of color. He also had been trained in what was then called dime museums, which were sort of like carnival-like attractions and vaudeville attractions, in which he would do his drawing in front of an audience, very speedily creating a character, an animal, etc., in a way that really sort of made people gasp. So he had these amazing talents. And like many artists with amazing talents, he was especially interested in dreams. Now, what most people know about Winsor McCay, if they do know his work at all, is The Adventures of Little Nemo in Slumberland. The sound of that is intentionally reminiscent of Alice in Wonderland, because what happens in the course of the Little Nemo stories is one perfectly ordinary little boy goes to bed in the first panel. And during the course of the strip, he has extraordinary heroic adventures in a kingdom that's very fairy tale like. He's always the hero. He wins the fair maiden, etc. In fact, he conforms to the things that Freud said little boys' egotistical fantasies are always about: being the hero, achieving his ambition, and finding the mate that he feels he deserves. So in the course of these adventures, Winsor McCay created comic strips that a mere 20 years after the form was invented already reinvented it, broke the conventions, played with the ideas, in fact, literally broke the frame sometimes. Everybody's used to that idea that, for example, a daily comic strip will be maybe 4 panels, one after the other. He began to draw outside the panel or make the panels round or do crazy things with them. But that was a comic strip that was based on the idea of the dream and adventures in dreams, and it's terrifically influential. Walt Disney and others always acknowledged the influence, but in fact, it shows up in basically every comic strip or animated cartoon that you've seen. In fact, Winsor McCay went on from the daily strips to more or less invent the animated cartoon. And back in those days, he did panel by panel drawings. He hadn't yet invented the system of having a background on a clear plate and the foreground drawn separately. So he did hundreds and hundreds of drawings, and we even have a film of him in this process, which was shown in movie theaters before his animated cartoons. Anyway, he was a great genius of the animated cartoon as well. But what we particularly remember him for in the contemporary period, I think, is this Nemo guy, because a lot of people who never heard of Winsor McCay have seen Finding Nemo, one of the most influential of modern cartoons created by Pixar and Walt Disney Studios. And that's not the only tribute to Nemo that you find in the history of cartoons. However, what I'm going to focus on in the conference is an earlier comic strip that he created, and one that's much weirder and more challenging. It's The Dreams of the Rarebit Fiend. This follows the idea, a sort of folkloric idea, that if you consume a Welsh rarebit or rabbit, there's still an argument about the etymology of that. That's basically a heated blend of cheese and ale that you dip toast into or pour over toast. It can be kind of delicious, actually. If you have one of those before bedtime, then you have a nightmare. This is what some people have referred to as the pepperoni pizza theory of the nightmare, that if you eat something that encourages indigestion, you'll have a nightmare, even to the point where some artists have tried it, have tried eating indigestible meals before sleep. But what McCay did that was extraordinary was there's no continuity of character. There's no continuity of place. Each strip is a separate nightmare by a separate individual, and some of them are extremely weird. So we see 8 panels, and each time the first panel is the beginning of the dream, and each time the last panel is the dreamer waking up, very often falling out of bed, and saying something along the lines of, "Oh gosh, I wish I hadn't eaten that Welsh rarebit." And you'd think you'd get really, really tired of it, but the strips are so incredibly inventive that they're always fascinating. And this is one of the longest running strips in American comic history because he dropped it and took it up again. It went for about 2 decades. So there are a lot of them available, but they haven't really been very much studied. I'm really interested in them for the main reason that these are coming in just the first decade of the 20th century. Freud's work did not appear in English until, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think about 1909, and these were all done before, the majority of them were done before that, the ones who remember. So he couldn't have read Freud, and there wasn't a lot of talk about Freud going on. He wasn't in intellectual circles. But all I'm saying is he is, like many artists, someone who had an intuitive sense of what goes on in dreams and used it to make these interesting artworks. Now, very often they might, like a dream, come from a pun. There's a great strip in which a woman has a corn on her toe. For those of you who have never encountered this, a corn is the term for a little kind of hard place that's painful, that appears only on toes. She has a nightmare that a stalk of corn grows and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and people start to pick the corn, etc. Or it might be, and this is an aspect of McCay's work that I find really fascinating, it might be the transformation of an ordinary object from the household, say, into something terrifying. There's one really wonderful cartoon where a person goes downstairs to look at the furnace, and the furnace slowly turns into a dragon that pursues him. And many, many other interesting instances. Some of these were actually turned into cartoons and even live action films in the silent era. But one of the reasons that we focus on Winsor McCay, and one of the reasons I personally find him so fascinating and hope to do more work on him, is the idea that the particular thoughts that the dreamer has had, the particular image that we see in the nightmare, is susceptible to analysis by all the modern principles of looking at dreams. I think that a very effective method of looking at a comic strip dream or a dream in art is just to ask yourself, as we very often do in dream groups, what would I be thinking if this were my dream? So you try to see it from your own perspective, and you realize you can't be inside the mind of the artist, but it might bring up stuff that's of great interest. So one of the reasons that I find this material so interesting, and that I'm peculiarly concerned with Winsor McCay, is he gives us an opportunity to see how visual imagery can state ideas in a way that words never could. Freud, Jung, even, except when he was, making the Red Book, but a lot of the great psychologists working in dreams, they have to work in words. And even when they tell us about a dream, you can go through hundreds of articles of this kind. You can go through all of Freud, and you see that he says the dream when what he means is a verbal account of the dream that I am writing down from what I remember that somebody told me. It's not the dream. But we see something much more interesting when we get to see this visual stuff. Another thing that I really find fascinating about McKay is there's very often, as I've mentioned, a transformation, a metamorphosis. The idea that something is changing into something else is very prominent in dreams, but you'll find if you look at, say, Freud's writing in roughly the same period, he's not thinking about that very much. And probably one of the reasons he's not thinking about it very much is X turned into Y isn't that interesting. Watching a furnace turn into a dragon is very, very interesting. And it does feel like what happens in a dream. That leads to one of the most interesting aspects of animated cartoons later, that animated cartoons become free of the necessity to reproduce what the outside world looks like because we can transform things in animated cartoons. And we can do it in the way that dreams do. There are Bugs Bunny cartoons, there are Porky Pig cartoons that do that. You can tell that I take this stuff really seriously. And I know that not everybody does, but just for background information, a lot of what I wrote about was popular art, cartoons, television, film. Finally, I just want to say that one of the things that the Dream of the Rarebit fiend points out to us or lets us think about is this question, so essential to thinking about dreams and creativity. Why is so much of the material that shows the creativity of dreams about nightmares? Why is it so often that the nightmare is the focus? Why do we have all these stories of Mary Shelley awaking from a terrifying dream? Even in many cases, a scientific discovery, the invention of the sewing machine, the famous story of the spears that look like needles. It's always a frightening situation. Now, I'm not going to do too much speculating right here because you can come to the conference presentation, you can go to the dream study groups and hear talk about it a little bit more. And you can also get in touch with me and discuss it if you wish. So that's what I have to say about Winsor McCay.
That's awesome. I appreciate you for sharing and introducing me to a new artist that I hadn't heard of. So I'm very excited. Yeah, I've never heard of Winsor McCay, but that's awesome. I love seeing how art has been depicted, how dreams have been depicted in art. And you bring up such a good point. Art is just as important as academic psychology when we're talking about dreams. It really brings up this whole layer, this visual layer that, like you said, words can't describe. So that's really awesome. I hope that people tune into your presentation.
I've done a lot of presentations about film and a certain number of presentations about literature at IASD conferences. But that's the great thing that I get out of them, and I hope the conference attendees get out of them, as with McKay. It is enough just to be introduced to a really, really cool artist that you hadn't heard of before, or to find out about a movie like Hitchcock's Vertigo or Spellbound or Ingmar Bergman's Wild Strawberries. That's a purpose in itself, whatever we say about these works.